And the pogroms end up being a cover story for this violence. The fact is, the pogroms did not occur. Now, there's two works here. The first is Oleg Platonov, who I've been reading for many years. Does not exist in English as far as I know. He wrote the book Truth and the Truth and the Myth about the pogroms. And the second, of course, is Solzhenitsyn 200 Years Together. Now, Solzhenitsyn says that the civil disturbances began, the first one was actually a real attack on the Jews after the murder of Alexander II. Despite the fact that the Russian press was very liberal and tried to cover this fact up, Jews, the major one, which occurred in Odessa, which was the Jewish capital of the Russian Empire, a rioting took place for a while, and a grand total of 1 Jew was killed. Now, in the Russian press, and then it was copied, without criticism in the English and then the American press, that tens of thousands had been killed. I said before, when you read the Russian press, so-called Russian press in this era, it's frightening. These guys had influence, especially over the upper classes, and there are no standards whatsoever. The journalists today are saints by comparison to these guys, and they simply made stuff up. They did everything. When the Russians were struggling against Japan, even before Port Arthur, the Russian press was claiming that 1 million Russian soldiers had been killed. Tsar Nicholas is responsible. He's incompetent, and the government is collapsing. Soldiers are deserting, and over and over again. One Russian soldier trips and falls, and the government is collapsing. It's time to abandon ship. You see, if you read the American press even today, every other story is that, yes, inflation has gone up 1% in Russia, collapse imminent. They're doing the same thing with China. It's wishful thinking. It's bad journalism. But at least, there's ways to check these people now. The big mistake of the Russian crown at the time was that they believed, and I understand their point of view, they believed that propaganda was beneath them. This was the domain of liars and scam artists, which generally speaking, it's true. Even the word propaganda has a negative connotation to it. But, and so they refused to do it, and they refused to support it. There were some subsidies given to the royalist press, but even by World War I, the royalist press was almost nothing. Overwhelmingly, it was liberal papers coming out of St. Petersburg, absolute disaster areas. They made up stories about really awful pornographic stories about the Empress St. Alexandra and Rasputin, which is a separate issue, but they just made stuff up. They're having sex, they're having orgies, they're drunk. This is all garbage, and they were putting this in the front page, and they're distributing this at the front, and they're doing trying to collapse the government. This is what was going on. Any actual revolutionary movement was created by this falsehood. I have read these articles myself. They are absolutely atrocious by any standard. Even if you were liberal at the time, looking at supporting these things is absolutely, it shows that they had absolutely no morality whatsoever. Solzhenitsyn writes concerning the press coverage of one of these non-existent pogroms. I'm going to quote him, and this is he's actually citing from the St. Petersburg Gazette of 1903. And this is my translation of what he wrote here. Quote, in St. Petersburg, frantic newspaper articles were read about the murders of women and infants, and on numerous occasions the rape of underage girls, wives raped in front of their husbands. One Jew had his belly ripped open, the insides came out. This is what one of the major presses were saying. Jewish women had nails driven into her head, through her nostrils. Within the same week, the Western papers reprinted these. They unconditionally believed the Russian press. Britain's leading Jews completely relied on these horrible articles and incorporated them into their protest slogans and leaflets, end quote. Solzhenitsyn has read the same things that I have. Now, this is 2002 when he wrote this. There's no denying it, and this is why it's been censored so tremendously in the West, Western Europe and America. Because he's simply he's doing absolutely nothing but citing the newspapers at the time. So any revolutionary thought by a Gentile worker or farmer is creation of this kind of mythology. This is at a time of tremendous success of Russia, both at home and abroad, where 98% of the Russian landmass was owned by the peasantry. And don't kid yourself. You read the proceedings of the Duma, especially the first two. And they say they want to dispossess the landlord class. Now, these are landlords, by the way, so they don't mean what they say. But the landlord class overwhelmingly was peasants. And given the fact what happened to them under Trotsky later on, maybe they're really already encoding that these people, these loyal Orthodox people, need to be destroyed. And by calling them landlords, as later on they'd be called kulaks, the ground was set for their destruction. Now let's make one thing clear here. Where these pogroms were alleged to have taken place were in the far west of the Russian Empire. These are the most Europeanized and wealthy parts of the empire, the nation. Now, we're talking about mostly Odessa, major port city, Kiev, Stardub, parts of Russian Romania, all over Ukraine, Minsk. Remember, these are absolutely critical, essential economic hubs of the Russian Empire. That you have professional tenured historians in this country making six figures, making the argument that the Russian monarchy was deliberately creating these pogroms and financing them, tearing apart, burning down their most critically essential cities economically, just shows you how bad American academia is. Call your typical, average academic historian who knows something about Russia and ask them. And they'll probably say, oh, yes, the Black Hundreds were a government organization and they were going to kill Jews and, of course, burn down these cities. I was taught that as an undergraduate. I didn't know how to respond to that. I knew that some of these cities were extremely large and very wealthy, and it didn't make sense to me. I couldn't articulate it very well, though, at the time. But it seemed odd that the government would want to destroy these because these pogroms were riots, essentially what the word means. And there were riots, and it would mean the destruction of millions of dollars worth of property. It doesn't make any sense. That's your first very basic argument. These things are the stuff of myth. One of the more interesting things, and this I did not know until I read Solzhenitsyn's book, was that certain elements of the left, the far left at the time, were claiming that the Russian government was protecting Jews in these very same cities. The fact of the matter, very few Jews were killed in these. There were certainly riots, there were certainly shootouts, there were certainly confrontations. The Jews had a tendency to be better armed than their opponents because there were no gun control laws in Tsarist Russia, certainly none that could be enforced, and certainly none that could be enforced on a wealthy segment of the population. But there's one organization, Solzhenitsyn quotes the Black Reparation Workers Group. They had a leaflet they put out in 1881 saying that, what a shame it is that the police and the army are protecting, and they actually use the phrase kulak Jews. This is very odd. I think this may be the first time in modern Russia this was used. But this is a communist, kind of semi-anarchist organization saying that, of course, the pogroms didn't happen because the Jews were part of the ruling class of Russia. They're very, very wealthy. And the riots against them were leftist. These were leftist riots demanding fairness and equalitarianism by dispossessing this very powerful segment of the ruling class, i.e. the Jews. Now, I had never heard of this group before, but Solzhenitsyn cites them more than once. And, it might be noted, and also I did not know this until I read Solzhenitsyn, that Alexander III was extremely angry at these civil disturbances and believed that those attacking, and either there were attacks on the Jews, especially after his father's murder, they were not being dealt with harshly enough. They were overwhelmingly Jewish, but that really didn't matter. What mattered the most is that these are some of the most significant cities in the world at the time. The Russian Empire could hardly be promoting anything but peace and tranquility in these areas that are so critical for Russia's economic development. One of the interior ministers at the time, Count Ignatieff, he writes this, and I'm translating this myself from Solzhenitsyn. The interior minister says the following, quote, recognizing the harm to the Christian population from the Jewish economic activities, their tribal exclusivity, and religious fanaticism, the last 20 years the government has tried to blend the Jews with the rest of the population using a whole row of initiatives, and has almost made some of the Jews equal in rights with the native inhabitants. However, the present anti-Jewish movement incontrovertibly proves that despite all the efforts of the state, relations between the Jews and the rest of us in these regions remain abnormal as it is in the past because of the economic issues, After the easing of any civil restriction, the Jews have not only seized commerce and trade, but they have acquired significant landed property. Moreover, because of their cohesion and solidarity, they have, with few exceptions, directed all their efforts not towards the increase of the productive strength of the state, but primarily towards the exploitation of the poorest classes of the surrounding population. End quote. Now, that's an extremely powerful statement. It is true. I don't care what source you use. It is incontrovertible. It cannot be debated. It is a simple matter of statistics. And he is simply saying that rather than use these newfound freedoms, and by the way, Ignatieff and many others say that there was never any restrictions on Jews in the Russian Empire. An empire is not a nation state. They don't enforce laws in Bessarabia the same way that the U.S. government enforces laws in Florida. That's not how it works. These regions were autonomous, self-governing. The central government, thanks to Peter I, was in St. Petersburg. It was a civilization away from the rest of Russia. Laws simply could not be. The Tsar couldn't say, I want this to end, and go send his minions out to end it. That's not how it worked. And often, again, professional historians, raking down these massive salaries and very little work, will just be lazy and stupid about it and treat the Tsar as absolute. Now, the word is ridiculous. The Tsar had no absolute. He had absolute responsibility, but not. I mean, no dictator, not even Stalin himself, can be absolute. Tsar was no different. He was limited by just off the top of my head. He was limited by local leaders, the commune, the merchant classes, Jewish power itself, violent terrorist organization, the military, the police, the church, powerful or charismatic figures like Seraphim Masra, people like this. This has to be canon law, church tradition, even saints' lives. These things were all checks on state power, let alone the independence of many ministers, the career bureaucrats who were very, very difficult to remove even then. And since the Charter of the Nobility was passed by Catherine II, they were an autonomous corporation. And laws did not apply to them unless they said it did. So that the Tsar's absolute is laughable. Nicholas I, who many say is this terrible tyrant, said that he has very little power because everything I want to do is stymied by these very powerful liberals in the nobility. The Decembrist revolt, so-called, was the highest levels of the landed nobility of the Russian Empire. So by the time of Nicholas II, the nobles, even though they were very deeply in debt and increasingly irrelevant, they had turned to Freemasonry, the Kabbalah, and secularism in all of its forms, and half the time we're not even speaking Russian.